Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing valvular heart disease. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing pathological processes which can give rise to stenosis or regurgitation in any of the four heart valves. And we've just discussed calcification, which is by far the major cause of valvular heart disease, particularly causing aortic stenosis. We're now going to discuss rheumatic heart disease, which is another pathological process which can give rise to valvular heart disease. So, rheumatic heart disease, the first thing I want to say is it's often abbreviated down to RHD. So, let me begin by telling you an overview of what happens in rheumatic heart disease to actually cause valvular heart disease, and then we'll go through the pathological process. So, rheumatic heart disease is a long-term permanent complication of suffering from episodes of acute rheumatic fever. So, this is a long-term complication of another illness called acute rheumatic fever. And acute rheumatic fever is exactly the same as rheumatic fever. We just sometimes put the acute in front of rheumatic fever to stress that rheumatic fever is a acute disease. It's a short-term disease, i.e. you get it and then it goes away. Okay, so acute rheumatic fever, you might not know anything about this disease at the moment. That doesn't matter. I'm going to tell you all about it in just a moment. But it is an acute illness. It's something that you get, it causes symptoms for a while, and then it goes away. And for short, it's often abbreviated down to ARF. Now, as a chronic complication of this, you can get rheumatic heart disease, particularly if you have multiple episodes of this. If you get acute rheumatic fever multiple times, it can then lead to you developing this chronic illness that doesn't go away, which is rheumatic heart disease. So let me explain why. So, in acute rheumatic fever, the heart can be affected, and we'll talk about what I mean when I say the heart can be affected later on. You can get inflammation in the heart, and this can affect not only the actual myocardium of the heart, but also the heart valves, and this is how it can lead to valvular heart disease, which is what rheumatic heart disease is. So you can get inflammation in the heart valves in acute rheumatic fever, and where you get inflammation, you tend to also get fibrosis. So let me write this down. So acute rheumatic fever leads to fibrosis, or can lead to. It doesn't necessarily always lead to. In fact, it's only in about 50% of cases of acute rheumatic fever do you have cardiac involvement at all. So it's not 100% of cases of acute rheumatic fever that you get cardiac involvement. But if you do have heart involvement, it can lead to fibrosis of the heart valve cusps. So whichever heart valves have been affected by the acute rheumatic fever, you can get fibrosis in the cusps of those heart valves. So, fibrosis, remember, is the fancy biology word for scarring. It means laying down new connective tissue, and we've discussed the fibrosis process as part of our discussion of calcification. So remember, in the calcification process, the macrophages and the T cells release that signaling molecule transforming growth factor beta, TGF-beta, and that caused fibroblasts, which were quiescent, to turn into myofibroblasts, and those started spitting out connective tissue, mainly collagen-based connective tissue. So that's how you produce scar tissue, by producing loads of new connective tissue. And it's a really important part of inflammation, because where you have an inflammatory response, you get massive tissue destruction, and you have to replace that with something. So the scar tissue, the fibrotic tissue, is what you replace it with. So when you have acute rheumatic fever and it affects a heart valve, the cusps of a heart valve, you'll get fibrosis in that heart valve afterwards, which will add more connective tissue to the heart valve. And this can actually lead to the heart valve losing its mobility. So it becomes more rigid, it loses its flexibility and loses its ability to move. And you can imagine what this is going to lead to now. If the heart valve cusps can't move as well, then they're not going to be able to open as wide an orifice, and therefore you're going to get stenosis. So this is overall what acute rheumatic fever can lead to. It can lead to valvular stenosis, particularly if you have multiple episodes of acute rheumatic fever. So let's imagine you've had 2 episodes of acute rheumatic fever, both affecting the same heart valve, then each of those will have caused fibrosis in the heart valve cusps, and that fibrosis will sum together to make the heart valve cusps, much less flexible than they would have been just after 1 episode of acute rheumatic fever, and therefore they'll make valvular stenosis worse. So it gets worse and worse the more episodes of acute rheumatic fever you have. And this then is how you get valvular heart disease, when you get multiple episodes of acute rheumatic fever leading to these permanent changes in the cusps of a heart valve that lead to that heart valve becoming stenotic. Okay, so rheumatic heart disease is a stenotic pathological process. It leads to the stenosis of heart valves. So the next question, of course, is which heart valves are affected most commonly? In principle, again, any of the 4 heart valves could be affected by rheumatic heart disease. In practice, there are certain heart valves that are affected far more often than others, and the one that is affected most commonly is the mitral valve, so the left atrioventricular valve. And indeed, this is the major cause of mitral stenosis. We discussed previously when we were discussing calcification that calcification can affect the mitral valve. Indeed, it's more common for it to affect the mitral valve than the tricuspid or the pulmonary valve. However, the major one that's affected by calcification is the aortic valve. So the major cause of mitral stenosis is not calcification, but is rather rheumatic heart disease. If you see someone with mitral stenosis, if you listen to their heart and they have the murmur of mitral stenosis, then it's nearly always the case that they've had rheumatic fever before, and that the reason they have this mitral stenosis is rheumatic heart disease rather than calcification. So the major cause, this is a take-home message here, the major cause of mitral stenosis is rheumatic heart disease. Now, not just the mitral valve can be affected though, it's certainly the most common one, but also the aortic valve can be affected, and it's not uncommon for the aortic valve to be affected. I mean, it's far more common for you to get aortic stenosis due to calcification, but you can get, some people will have aortic stenosis due to rheumatic heart disease. So the general statistics that are given is that around 2/3 of cases of rheumatic heart disease will just be mitral stenosis, and the other 1/3 of cases will have aortic stenosis and mitral stenosis. So I'll add this on. So 2/3 of cases just mitral valve involvement, and 1/3 of cases aortic valve involvement, but also mitral valve involvement, so both of the valves are affected. And then going to the right heart valves, I mean, in principle they can be affected, in practice they're never affected. But in principle you could see someone with tricuspid valve stenosis due to rheumatic heart disease. It's not impossible. But these are the 2 major heart valves that are affected. Okay, so there's an overview of what rheumatic heart disease is. It is fibrosis of the heart valve cusps of a heart valve due to rheumatic fever episodes affecting the cusps of that heart valve. Okay, and it's a chronic complication, therefore, of acute rheumatic fever. Okay, so let's now discuss then the pathogenesis of this. Let's do the full story. So to discuss rheumatic heart disease then, we're going to have to discuss acute rheumatic fever. We need to understand this illness. So I need to tell you the story of what happens in acute rheumatic fever. So acute rheumatic fever occurs as a horrible consequence in some people, and it is a very rare consequence, of a streptococcus pharyngitis, specifically a group A beta hemolytic streptococcus pharyngitis. So let me tell you all about this group A beta hemolytic streptococcus pharyngitis. So it is called strep throat. And this is an illness where you get an extremely sore throat and not many other symptoms usually. However, very rarely, and if you're very, very unlucky, and it is a very rare consequence, you can develop rheumatic fever secondary to strep throat. So let me firstly tell you about strep throat. So it causes a sore throat, I should say, and not all sore throats will be strep throat. So let me firstly tell you about the bacterium which actually causes this. So the bacterium which causes it is called Streptococcus pyogenes, but it has another name that people use more often, which is group A beta hemolytic streptococcus. So Streptococcus pyogenes, also called group A because it is classified long ago in the Landsfield classification as being group A. Now, I do not know enough bacteriology to know exactly how the Landsfield classification works, but just know that this is some sort of classification. A person called Landsfield long ago classified bacteria, and this bacterium was put in group A. Okay, so it's group A, and that's the Landsfield classification. So you'll sometimes hear people in full calling it Landsfield group A. So Landsfield. So Landsfield group A, and then beta hemolytic streptococcus, and this refers to the fact that it will lyse red blood cells. So if it's grown on a plate, a blood agar plate, which contains red blood cells, what you actually find is that around the areas where it's growing, you'll get hemolysis of the red blood cells. So you'll get a change in the colour of the agar. So normally a blood agar plate is red. Where you've had the hemolysis, because the bacterial cells are growing near there, you'll have the blood agar going clear. Okay, so that just refers to the fact that it can lyse red blood cells because of a toxin it produces. So group A, beta hemolytic, and then streptococcus. And streptococcus refers to the fact that it is a coccus bacterium, so it's a round bacterium, and also it grows in lines. So that's what streptococcus means. The strepto portion refers to the fact that it grows in lines, so you'll get whole lines of bacterial cells. So let me just draw a little picture of our Streptococcus pyogenes. So it has a cell membrane and it's a nice round cell, so here it is. It won't have a nucleus because remember bacterial cells don't have nuclei, they just have the DNA in the cytoplasm. Then it's actually a gram-positive bacterium. All Streptococcus species are gram-positive, so under the gram staining process it will stain blue, so gram-positive. And remember, what this actually means in terms of the bacterial structure is that it just has one phospholipid bilayer, one membrane, which is the cell membrane, and then around the cell membrane it has a big, thick peptidoglycan cell wall. So in blue here, this is representing the peptidoglycan cell wall. So this is the cell wall made up of peptidoglycan. Okay, so this is a nice little picture of our Streptococcus pyogenes, so that we've got a picture of it. Okay, and finally, just discussing the Streptococcus thing, the strepto bit refers to the fact that it will grow in lines. So if you have lots of bacterial cells on a microscope slide and you're looking at them, it'll look like this if you've got them all stained. They grow in these beautiful lines, and the reason they do this is because they always divide down the same axis. So if you imagine this cell dividing, it'll divide and produce two new cells that will contribute to this line. So it always divides in the axis perpendicular to the line in which it's growing, which is why it can actually produce these lines. So that's what the streptococcus means. Strepto means the lines, coccus means that it's a round cell. Okay, so Streptococcus pyogenes is the specific species that's going to cause strep throat. So you usually have it present to some degree on the back of the throat anyway, and I'm now just going to actually draw a little picture of the throat so that I've got something to point at. So I'm drawing now a picture of someone's face from the side, and we're imagining we've cut through. So it's a sagittal section. So here's the nose, here are the lips, here's the chin, and then the neck is here. Okay, so now I'm going to show the sagittal section, so it's quite a gross section when you actually think about the practicalities of doing it, but here's the picture. So here's the nasal cavity coming backwards, here's the oral cavity, and then of course they join together with the pharynx at the back, which is also called the throat. And then what happens is as the throat comes down here, it's going to split into two, the esophagus is at the back, and then you'll have the larynx at the front here, like so, and then the trachea below. And because the anatomy of the larynx is so complicated, I've just drawn a box in a tongue-in-cheek way. Okay, so let me try and label up my picture, and it's a little bit small, so I think I'll zoom in to label it on. Okay, so here we have the nasal cavity. Okay, then we have the oral cavity, which is this thing here. So this is representing the oral cavity. And then at the back we have the throat, and the proper name for the throat is the pharynx. So at the back here is the pharynx. And the pharynx is all of this. This is the pharynx, this is the pharynx, all the way down to here. All of this is the pharynx. Now you can split it up into 3 separate bits. The bit up here by the nasal cavity here, the continuation of the nasal cavity backwards, if you like, this is called the nasopharynx. So that makes sense. Then the bit of the pharynx that's behind the oral cavity, so this bit here, this is called the oropharynx. So this is the oropharynx. And then finally, the bit before the laryngeal inlet, where the larynx comes off, and this is called the laryngopharynx. So this is the laryngopharynx. And now I'll just label up the esophagus and the larynx and the trachea as well. So here is the esophagus at the back, where of course food hopefully goes down to the stomach. And here at the front, this box is representing the larynx. And then, of course, underneath the larynx, the continuation of it downwards to the lungs is then the trachea, or the windpipe. Okay, right, so here is my picture of the pharynx then. So strep throat is going to be an infection of the pharynx, and we call this pharyngitis. Pharyngitis specifically means inflammation of the pharynx, but of course, when you have an infection of the pharynx, you're going to get inflammation there. So, pharyngitis causes a sore throat. This is infection of the pharynx. And this is what a sore throat is. Pain will occur because of the inflammation. So pharyngitis will cause a sore throat. So, strep throat then means infection of the pharynx, so the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx, all of this bit, by Streptococcus pyogenes. Now, Streptococcus pyogenes is normally present on the surface of the pharynx, because you have to understand the pharynx is not sterile at all. It's covered in bacterial cells, and these are commensal bacterial cells. They don't normally cause us any harm, so the pharynx is usually covered in commensals. Now, you have very small numbers of Streptococcus pyogenes cells on the pharynx usually, okay? So you'll have these very scarcely in amongst all the other bacterial species, and there are absolutely loads of them on the surface of the pharynx. So you have very small numbers of these usually on the surface of the pharynx, and they don't normally cause a problem. The problem in strep throat is that they overgrow, so these become a far too large component of the commensal population. So you get far too many of these now on the pharynx, and then they start to actually cause a problem, and that's when they cause group A beta hemolytic streptococcus pharyngitis. And by the way, we often abbreviate group A beta hemolytic streptococcus down to GA for group A, and then BH for beta hemolytic, and then S for streptococcus. So you would call this GABHS pharyngitis is another name for strep throat, and it's caused, as I've already said, by an overgrowth of the population of Streptococcus pyogenes on the surface of the pharynx. Now, most cases of a sore throat are not due to Streptococcus pyogenes overgrowth. there are many other things that can cause a sore throat, and it's usually a viral infection. So sore throats and slash pharyngitis, this is usually caused by a viral infection. So it's usually caused by a viral infection. And these viral infections usually affect more than just the pharynx. So often they affect either the nasal cavity, or they might affect lower down. They might affect the larynx and maybe even the trachea. And therefore they usually cause associated symptoms. So if they affect the nasal cavity, they're going to cause a runny nose. So a runny nose will occur if they affect the nasal cavity. And if they affect lower down, if they go into the larynx or the trachea, they're going to cause a cough. So we call these viral infections viral upper respiratory tract infections. I'm going to put upper respiratory tract infection here. So the U is for upper, R is for respiratory, and T is for tract, because all of this is counted as the respiratory tract, because of course air comes in through the nose usually, goes through the pharynx and then down into the larynx and trachea, so it's still counted as the respiratory tract. And for short, a upper respiratory tract infection is often referred to as a URTI. Okay, so viruses that can cause these upper respiratory tract infections, they're often rhinoviruses and coronaviruses. So I'll put this over here. So there are loads of different viruses that can cause an upper respiratory tract infection, and they're usually rhinoviruses. And the other major type of virus that can cause it is coronaviruses. And as I say, usually they don't just infect the throat. Usually they will also affect the nasal cavity, in which case they'll cause a runny nose, or they will go down further and they'll cause a cough as well as the sore throat. So you'll get the sore throat and these associated symptoms. And we call this the common cold or the common cough. So often when you've just got a runny nose, we'll call that the common cold. A runny nose and a sore throat, sorry. That's the common cold. So that's a very high up viral upper respiratory tract infection affecting the pharynx and the nasal cavity. And when it goes lower down, so it affects maybe the pharynx and the larynx and maybe even the trachea, we'll call that the common cough. And these aren't dangerous. Your body will fight them off usually. There is another virus that can infect the upper respiratory tract and can cause a sore throat, runny noses and coughs, and that's influenza viruses. But they generally cause a more systemic illness as well, which of course we call flu, where you'll get things like muscle ache and you'll feel really quite unwell and really quite tired, whereas upper respiratory tract infection caused by rhinoviruses and coronaviruses, usually you don't feel as unwell as you would if it was infected by influenza viruses. So influenza viruses can also infect the upper respiratory tract. They can cause pharyngitis, they can cause laryngitis and tracheitis and cause a cough, and they can also cause a more systemic illness. And in fact, if your upper respiratory tract infection is caused by influenza virus, you usually get a more systemic illness. And the classic thing that flu causes is muscle aches. So muscle aches. And of course, you will also feel really unwell if you're infected with influenza virus. You'll feel very tired and very unwell. Okay, so this is of course what we call flu. Right, so often then when you get a sore throat, it will not be strep throat. Instead, it will be a viral upper respiratory tract infection, either rhinoviruses and coronaviruses, and these cause common coughs and common colds, depending on which other surrounding areas they affect. If they affect the nasal cavity and the pharynx, you'll get a runny nose and a sore throat, and that's called a common cold. If it affects the pharynx and then it goes lower down, the larynx and the trachea, you'll get a common cough. And if it's influenza virus that is causing the upper respiratory tract infection, you'll get all of these symptoms as well. So if it affects the nasal cavity, you'll get a runny nose. If it affects the larynx and the trachea, you'll get a cough. but it also causes a more systemic illness where you'll get muscle aches, you'll feel really tired, really quite unwell, and that we call flu. Okay, right, so those are the common causes of a sore throat. Now let's go back to Streptococcus pyogenes throat, or strep throat. So in strep throat, in contrast to these viral upper respiratory tract infections, you just get pharyngitis, so you just get a sore throat. You will not have a runny nose, you will not have a cough, you just have the sore throat. And it's estimated that in adults, about 10% of sore throats are strep throat rather than a viral upper respiratory tract infection. So 10% in adults are caused by Streptococcus pyogenes rather than just a viral upper respiratory tract infection, and the other 90% will generally be viral upper respiratory tract infections. Okay, whereas in children aged 5 to 15, it's believed to be much higher. It's believed to be about 30% of sore throats in children between the ages of 5 and 15, in children 5 to 15 years old. Okay, so it's believed to be more common in children than in adults, Streptococcus pyogenes throat. Right, okay, so there is strep throat. Let me just summarise it because this is really important that we understand this before we now move on to acute rheumatic fever. So this is a common illness and your body will be able to fight it off on its own. You can, of course, treat it with antibiotics and they will lead to the resolution slightly quicker, but it should, even if your immune system is just doing it on its own, clear reasonably quickly, at least, at the very most, within a week. It'll take to go. Okay, and what happens is you get overgrowth of the Streptococcus pyogenes species of bacterial cell, which is normally present on the surface of the pharynx. This bacterial species is also called the group A beta hemolytic Streptococcus species. And here's a little picture of what the bacterial cells actually look like. They have a cell membrane surrounded by a peptidoglycan cell wall. Okay, so what happens then is you get overgrowth of the Streptococcus pyogenes cells on the surface of the pharynx, and this leads to pharyngitis, inflammation of the pharynx, which correlates to a sore throat. And in strep throat, you just get a sore throat. So strep throat is the name for pharyngitis caused by Streptococcus pyogenes, and you just get a sore throat. This is in contrast to what is the more common cause of a sore throat, which is a viral upper respiratory tract infection. Now, the viruses which can commonly cause upper respiratory tract infections are influenza viruses, rhinoviruses, and coronaviruses. Rhinoviruses and coronaviruses, these cause the common cold and the common cough. They will infect the pharynx and surrounding tissue. If they affect the nasal cavity, you'll get a runny nose. If they affect the larynx and trachea, then you'll get a cough as well as the sore throat. And they don't make you feel that ill. They might give you a slight fever, they might make you feel a little bit more tired than usual, but generally you can go to work and function normally as you would with a viral upper respiratory tract infection caused by these viruses. More severe is a viral upper respiratory tract infection caused by an influenza virus. This will cause the same things as we've discussed here for the rhinoviruses and the coronaviruses, but it also causes a much more systemic illness. It will lead to muscle aches and it really makes you feel quite dreadful. It makes you feel very, very ill and you don't feel as though you can actually go to work and function normally. All you want to do is lie in bed and not talk to anyone. So it makes you very tired, very unwell feeling, and will give you a fever. Okay, right. So those are the more common causes of sore throats, and overall we estimate that around 10% of sore throats in adults will be strep throat rather than a viral upper respiratory tract infection, and about 30% of sore throats in children between the ages of 5 and 15 will be strep throat rather than a viral upper respiratory tract infection. So let me stress again that this is not dangerous. Your body will fight off the Streptococcus pyogenes on its own. You can take antibiotics for it and it will speed up the recovery. Okay, now a very rare complication of strep throat is that you can get acute rheumatic fever, and this is a very rare complication. So let's now discuss acute rheumatic fever. So in some people who get strep throat you can get acute rheumatic fever. So this can lead to acute rheumatic fever. Now, this is the part where our understanding of the pathogenesis is somewhat fuzzy, so you're going to have to bear with me saying quite regularly, at least to our current understanding, this is true. Okay, so we think that not everyone in the population can get acute rheumatic fever. We think that you have to have certain genetic susceptibility in order for strep throat to actually cause acute rheumatic fever. In addition, it also has to be the case that you're exposed to Streptococcus pyogenes cells that have a very high, that are of a certain type and we believe that the key characteristic that they need is to have a high expression of a protein called M protein. So let me now expand this arrow. So I've drawn here an arrow between strep throat and acute rheumatic fever. I'm now going to expand that and talk about it in more detail. So, in order for strep throat to actually cause acute rheumatic fever, you need two things. We firstly think you have to have genetic susceptibility, so not everyone can actually get acute rheumatic fever, at least that's our current understanding. So genetic susceptibility. So something about your genetic makeup predisposes you to actually being able to suffer from this disease. And you'll see why in a moment, because it is fundamentally an autoimmune response triggered by the Streptococcus infection. So you need genetic susceptibility to actually be able to get it. And then we also think that the Streptococcus pyogenes that is actually overgrown in your pharynx has to have a certain characteristic. So you have to understand that not all of the Streptococcus pyogenes cells in the world are identical to one another. They do vary. They have, they are individuals. Okay, and we believe that the Streptococcus pyogenes population that you need to be infected with in order to get acute rheumatic fever has to have this characteristic of having high M protein expression. So I'll put that the group A beta hemolytic streptococcus has to have a high M protein expression. So let me just tell you about this protein, M protein. So M protein is a surface protein on the surface of the Streptococcus pyogenes cell. So if I go back to my picture over here of the Streptococcus pyogenes cell and now add on M protein, so it goes through the cell membrane and it goes through the cell wall, and then you have a surface of it exposed on the surface of the cell. So this means that the immune response to Streptococcus pyogenes can actually use this as a target to attack. It can produce antibodies against this because it's a surface antigen, and that's very significant. So we think this protein, M protein, is incredibly important in acute rheumatic fever. That might change in the future. It might turn out that there are far more proteins that are important about the Streptococcus pyogenes than just M protein. But at our current level of understanding and for a very simple model, we think this M protein is very, very critical in the pathogenesis of acute rheumatic fever. Okay, so for strep throat then to cause acute rheumatic fever, you need to have a genetically susceptible host, and they need to be unlucky enough to get strep throat where the bacterium has a very high expression of M protein. So M protein needs to be high. If you have both of these things, then it can lead to acute rheumatic fever. So now there, it can lead to acute rheumatic fever. So how? What actually happens? So, it's an autoimmune response triggered by the infection with the Streptococcus pyogenes. So what happens when you get the strep throat? You're going to launch an immune response, an adaptive immune response against the Streptococcus pyogenes, and you're going to produce antibodies against the Streptococcus pyogenes. So, let me now put this in. So, in fact, we can now expand this arrow even further. So let's imagine that I haven't drawn this bit here, and we're now going to take the story further. We're going to fill in the gap. Okay, so in the genetically susceptible person who's been infected with the Streptococcus pyogenes with the high M protein expression, what they're now going to produce is antibodies against the antigens of Streptococcus pyogenes, so antibodies are going to be produced, and specifically they're going to produce antibodies against the M protein. So I'll just put that in brackets here. They'll produce anti-M antibodies, and the shorthand for antibodies is ABs. So let me just draw a little picture of an antibody here. So I'll zoom in so that I can draw it nice and big. So remember, the basic structure of an antibody is it consists of 4 separate polypeptides joined together, and really it's a dimer of dimers. So you have 2 sets of identical proteins. So here are 2 identical proteins. These are the heavy chains in yellow here. So these are the antibody heavy chains. And then you have 2 more proteins that are identical to one another, and these are the light chains. So in red here, these are the light chains. So you take 2 identical heavy chains, you take 2 identical light chains, you bind them together in this way. So there's a bond there between that light chain and that heavy chain. There's a bond there between that light chain and that heavy chain, and there's also a bond between the 2 heavy chains in the middle. And this is what the basic structure of an antibody is. Now, the bits right at the top, so this bit here and this bit here, are the bits which combines to antigens. So remember, as part of the adaptive immune response, you produce specific antibodies. The adaptive immune response is incredible. The whole reason it's called the adaptive immune response is that it launches a different response to different pathogens. The response is specific to the pathogen. So you produce antibodies where these little domains that I've highlighted in green here are specifically capable of binding to epitopes of the antigen associated with the pathogen that you are currently infected with. So if I just draw my pathogen very basically here, I won't bother drawing the cell wall on it. Here's my little circular cell. It's covered in proteins. So here's a protein, here's another protein in a different shape, here's another protein here. All of these are potential targets to launch adaptive immune responses against, and they're called antigens, and they are just the things that can have antibodies made against them. So gen here is short for genesis, to create. They are the things which can have antibodies created against them. Now, these regions of the antibody are the regions that are actually going to bind to antigens. So these are called the antigen binding sites, and for short, antigen is often abbreviated down to AG. So these are the antigen binding sites, and of course they're going to be identical. The 2 antigen binding sites that you have on a single antibody molecule are going to be identical because these yellow proteins are identical and these red proteins are identical. Okay, so each antibody molecule has 2 antigen binding sites, and these combine to specific little domains of antigens, and those specific little domains of antigens are known as epitopes. So a single antigen will have a huge number of epitopes. So maybe this little corner of this antigen, this is an epitope of it. So a single pathogen will have a huge number of proteins which are antigens and can have antibodies made against them, and each antigen will have a huge number of epitopes, all of which can have antibodies made against them. So as part of the adaptive immune response against the pathogen, you produce loads of antibodies where the antigen binding sites of these antibodies are able to bind to epitopes of the antigens of the pathogen. Okay, so that's what you're actually going to now produce. I'm not going to go through the full immune system pathways of how all of it is activated so that you produce antibodies that are specific against epitopes of the antigens of this pathogen, because it would take me hours. I have a huge video which I think has 24 separate parts on the immune system in the playlist on the immune system. So if you want to brush up your immunology, go and watch that. But it literally takes me hours to describe the adaptive immune response initiation. So we're going to skip that huge great discussion of how you actually make these, and we're just going to accept that you do make them. Okay, so against the Streptococcus pyogenes infection, you are going to produce then antibodies against epitopes of the antigens. And if the Streptococcus pyogenes has a very high expression of M protein, you are going to produce antibodies against epitopes of the M protein. So you'll produce anti-M antibodies. Now, genetic susceptibility plays a big part here because genetics controls which antibodies you can actually produce. Different people, if I took two different people, so this is a crucial bit of understanding here. So if I take two different people, so let's have man 1 here and man 2 here. So number 1 and number 2. Okay, these two are not identical twins. They are not even related. They're they're just people who have met on the street, let's say. Okay, if I infected both of them with Streptococcus pyogenes, the collection of antibodies they would produce against epitopes of antigens on that Streptococcus pyogenes would be different. So they would produce different antibodies against different epitopes. Okay, so everyone's immune response is different. And the reason, of course, is genetics. So genetics controls exactly which antibodies you're going to make, i.e. exactly which epitopes of the antigens of the Streptococcus pyogenes you will actually make. This is why genetic susceptibility plays such a big role, because the antibodies are absolutely crucial here, and which ones you produce is therefore really important. Okay, so let's now go on. So you produce these antibodies, absolutely fantastic. That's going to help annihilate the Streptococcus pyogenes because these are now going to go and bind all over the Streptococcus pyogenes cells, and they're going to ruin whatever the function of these proteins actually is. They're also going to mean that phagocytes will see these for what they are and will destroy them because they're covered in antibodies. They'll also activate the classical complement cascade, which will destroy the pathogen. So, antibodies have a huge number of ways of killing bacterial cells. And don't forget, one of the major ways that antibodies kill the cells is that they're going to disturb the function of whatever the proteins that they're binding to is. That's one that people always miss. They love talking about how you get opsonization and the activation of the complement cascade, but don't forget that you are preventing whatever the function of that protein that the antibody is bound to actually occurring, and that disturbance to the bacterial cell's behavior is a huge component of how you're actually going to lead to that cell dying. Okay, right, so you produce these antibodies, brilliant. Where does it all go wrong? Well, in certain people, the antibodies you produce can now bind to self-proteins, and there is basically the answer. You can probably now see what's going to go wrong. You have set up an autoimmune response. Everything goes wrong now. So there's a fancy word for this. These antibodies that you've produced against epitopes of antigens of the Streptococcus pyogenes can cross-react. This means that they can bind not just to the epitope of the antigen on the Streptococcus pyogenes that they were meant to bind to, but they might also be able to bind to another protein, and this protein might be one of your own proteins. So you have to understand that if this was absolutely perfect, these things would only be able to bind to a single epitope of a single protein, and that would only be this epitope of the antigen on the Streptococcus pyogenes. But in reality, this is real life. These things are just great big molecules. This likes to bind to this, but it might be able to bind to a whole lot of other things as well. It's all just chemical interactions, and if the chemical interactions are good enough with something else, then it will be able to bind to that as well, and then it will launch immune responses against that something else. And this is where it goes horribly wrong. You produce, if you're going to develop acute rheumatic fever, antibodies to the Streptococcus pyogenes that can cross-react with other proteins. So specifically self-proteins. So these cross-react with self-proteins. And this is going to trigger an autoimmune response. And this is actually the way that a lot of autoimmune responses are believed to be created. So many autoimmune diseases, we think that it's triggered by some infection that you launch an adaptive immune response against, and then you get cross-reactivity where the immune response is then capable of attacking self-proteins. So the antibodies will cross-react with self-proteins, and therefore acute rheumatic fever is an autoimmune disease. Okay, right. So, what do I now want to say? So here is the technical bit again. So, again, in our very simple model, our very simple current understanding of acute rheumatic fever is that M protein is incredibly important. So we think potentially that in the people who are going to develop acute rheumatic fever, you specifically produce antibodies against the M protein, and we think it's the anti-M antibodies that then are the ones that cross-react. However, that might be completely oversimplified. So if you want to be fail-safe in what you say, you should say that in someone who is genetically susceptible to developing acute rheumatic fever, they get infected with group A beta hemolytic streptococcus, they produce antibodies against it, and some of these antibodies, we're not sure which ones specifically, will then cross-react with other self-proteins, and that's what's going to then trigger all of the horrible symptoms of acute rheumatic fever, which I'm about to come on to. If you are a gambler and you like a nice simple story and you're hoping that the simple story is actually going to be true, then what you would say is, in someone who's going to develop acute rheumatic fever, they are genetically susceptible, which is all to do with which antibodies they're going to produce, and they get infected with group A beta hemolytic streptococcus with a high M protein expression. They produce lots of antibodies against the group A beta hemolytic streptococcus, and of course they produce anti-M antibodies against it. Then some of the anti-M antibodies that are directed against epitopes of M protein, those are the ones which can cross-react with self-proteins. So we do think that the anti-M antibodies are incredibly important and that these might be the ones that are actually cross-reacting. However, that might be wrong. It might turn out in years to come that actually M protein isn't the only one that you produce antibodies against which cross-react. But if you want a nice simple story, it's specifically the anti-M antibodies that are the ones which cross-react with self-proteins. Okay, so let's now talk about where you're going to get these cross-reactivities causing problems. So the first thing to say is we don't really know which self-proteins are actually attacked by these antibodies which are cross-reacting. We do know which sites are affected because that's just a clinical fact. So one of the major sites that is affected, and I should say now that in different people with acute rheumatic fever, different sites are affected. There are how many sites am I going to go over? There are 4 major sites that are affected, but it is not the case that everyone with acute rheumatic fever will get all 4 sites involved. In different people, you get different sites involved. I'm going to start off with the most common site to be involved. So, in 80% of people with acute rheumatic fever, you get involvement in the synovial joints. So 80% get involvement in synovial joints, and this is going to cause inflammation of the synovial joints, and this is why the whole thing is called rheumatic fever. Rheumatic means pertaining to joints. Rheumatology is the branch of medicine which deals with the joints. It's the study of the joints. So the reason it's called rheumatic fever is because the major place that is involved is the synovial joint. So let me just go over the structure of a synovial joint, and then we'll discuss what's actually going to happen in acute rheumatic fever. And then we'll go on to 2 other sites that are involved, and then we'll discuss the heart involvement, and we'll finish up our discussion of rheumatic heart disease. So, a picture then of a synovial joint. So a synovial joint is between 2 bones, of course. So to start the picture, let's have 2 bones. And by the way, a synovial joint is one of the ones which has a joint capsule around it and has synovial fluid within it. And it's generally quite a mobile joint. So these 2 things here, these are bones. So bone 1 and bone 2 here. Now, at the surface where they're going to articulate, where they're going to touch each other, they are coated in hyaline cartilage, which is less frictionless. So you'll get less friction if you've got hyaline cartilage rubbing against hyaline cartilage than if you've got bone rubbing against bone. Okay, so in green here, this is hyaline cartilage over the articular surfaces of the bones, and then you're going to have the joint capsule surrounding this. So let me put the joint capsule in here. So in red all the way around, like so. This is the joint capsule, and of course it will go on this side as well, like so. And then in the space, which is known as the synovial cavity, so this is called the synovial cavity, this is full of fluid called synovial fluid. So this is full of synovial fluid. Right, so now what I want to do is just discuss the structure of the joint capsule in a little bit more detail. So this here, all around the synovial joint, this is the joint capsule. So let me now cut out a bit of this joint capsule. So let's cut out a sample of our joint capsule here and have a look at the different layers. So the two major divisions then are that around the outside you have a fibrous capsule. So this outer region here, this is fibrous capsule, and I'll just change colour for this. So I'll have this in pink here. So this is the fibrous portion of the joint capsule, and this is going to consist of lots of connective tissue. So I'll colour this in pink here. So a huge amount of connective tissue here. And this is the actual strong portion of the joint capsule. This is the bit that actually gives it strength and rigidity, and it stops the whole thing from breaking. Now, the inner portion of the joint capsule is a softer portion, and this is known as the synovial membrane, and this is responsible for producing the synovial fluid. It's also called the synovium for short, if you don't like synovial membrane. So synovial membrane, but you can also call it the synovium for short. And the synovial membrane has two separate layers. So I'll divide it now into two. It has a portion that's right next to the synovial cavity. So remember, here is the synovial cavity where the synovial fluid is, and that's called the synovial intima. So this is the synovial intima here, and then it has a portion that's underneath the synovial intima towards the fibrous capsule, and this is called the subintima. Okay, now the subintima consists of connective tissue, more connective tissue, along with small blood vessels in it, so arterioles and venules and the capillaries, and of course nerves as well. So I'll just draw a few of those. So here we have a little arteriole, here we have a little venule, I'll put another little venule, and you'll have lots of capillaries in there, and those capillaries are where fluid will actually come out, and that fluid is going to make the synovial fluid. So the major job of the synovial membrane is to secrete the synovial fluid. So up here in red we have the synovial fluid, and the actual fluid that makes up the synovial fluid, so the water and the electrolytes, that's going to come out of capillaries, so that's going to come from the subintima. Okay, now synovial fluid, however, is not just water with a few electrolytes in that's come out of capillaries. It has a number of proteins in it that make it more viscous, and this allows it to lubricate the joint surface. So of course the function of the synovial fluid is to lubricate the two surfaces of the joint, so these two articular surfaces, so that friction is reduced even further. And these other components of the synovial fluid are put in there by the cells of the intima of the synovial membrane. So let me now just put these on. So there are two types of cell in the intima of the synovial membrane. One that I'll colour in yellow here, and these aren't representing the nuclei, they're representing the entire cell. So these yellow blobs are representing one type of cell, which is the type A synoviocyte. And then there is another type of synoviocyte which is called the type B synoviocyte. So synoviocyte, of course, just refers to cell of the synovial membrane. And then in this greeny colour here, you're going to have type B synoviocytes. And I apologise for choosing that colour. It's not particularly different from the yellow colour, but never mind. So Those are the type B synoviocytes. So the synovial intima consists of type A synoviocytes and type B synoviocytes. Now the type B synoviocytes are the ones which secrete the protein components of the synovial fluid, and examples of those protein components are the protein lubricin, and then another molecule called hyaluronic acid, which is not a protein. So hyaluronic acid. So the type B synoviocytes, they secrete molecules into the synovial fluid to make it more viscous so that it can lubricate the two joint surfaces and reduce friction. The fluid of the synovial fluid, that comes from the subintima, the capillaries in there. I also want to point out that you've got nerves in the synovial subintima, so I'll put one of those there, because that's going to be important in just a moment when I come to discuss the arthritis and arthralgia that you're going to get in rheumatic fever. The type A synoviocytes, just to complete up the picture, these are macrophage-like, so they are phagocytes. So these are effectively macrophages, and indeed often you can hear them called the synovial macrophages, and their job is to keep the synovial fluid clean. So if there's any gunk that shouldn't be in the synovial fluid, they will see it and they will phagocytose it and therefore remove it from the synovial fluid. Okay, so that was a little bit of background physiology and anatomy here. So this is a picture of a synovial joint, and I think I will just put that as the title here. So this is a synovial joint, and you have loads of synovial joints in your body. All of the mobile joints are synovial joints. So your knee joint, your hip joint, your elbow joint, your shoulder joint, all of those joints are going to be synovial joints, and they will have this structure. Here are the two bones, whoops, meant to get the laser pointer. Here are the two bones with a layer of hyaline cartilage over the surface, and then a fibrous capsule around the outside, and a synovial cavity full of synovial fluid inside. Looking at the structure of the the joint capsule, it consists of a fibrous capsule, which is the outer bit, that's a very tough layer of connective tissue, and then the synovial membrane, which is much softer. The synovial membrane has two layers. It has the subintima, which is responsible for actually producing the fluid that's going to make up the synovial fluid. So it contains microvasculature that will secrete the fluid with electrolytes. It's also got nerve innervation. And then you have the intima, which has two types of cell, type A and type B synoviocytes. The type B synoviocytes, they secrete lubricin and hyaluronic acid, which make the synovial fluid more viscous and allow it to lubricate better. And then the type A synoviocytes, which are macrophage in nature, and they're going to phagocytose any gunk that's in the synovial fluid and remove it, therefore, and keep the synovial fluid nice and clean. Okay, right, so this is just a reminder of the structure of a synovial joint. So what's going to happen now in acute rheumatic fever, we're going to have produced antibodies, potentially these anti-M antibodies, if you believe that theory, that are going to come into the synovium. They're going to come into the synovial membrane, and they're going to end up also in the synovial fluid. So they're going to come out through these capillaries. They're going to end up here because antibodies go all over the body. So they're going to come into the joints, and there they're going to bind to some sort of protein, some sort of self-protein, and we do not know what that self-protein is, but they bind to a self-protein in the synovial joints, and therefore you get an immune complex produced. So this is an important piece of terminology, the terminology immune complex. So an immune complex is quite simply an antibody molecule bound to another protein. It's also called an antigen-antibody complex or an antibody-antigen complex. Now, when an antibody has bound to a protein, it then changes its properties completely, and it can now activate the inflammatory response in an area. So you have to understand that when the antibody molecules do not have a protein bound to them, them coming into this tissue causes absolutely no problem whatsoever. If they then bind to something, that causes a big problem, because once they bound to a protein, they can then set off the inflammatory response. Remember, if they've bound to a protein, these things have been produced on the understanding that they only bind to pathogenic proteins. So if they find a protein that they've bound to in here, they're going to set off the alarm signal, which is the inflammatory response, because they believe that there is a pathogen present in here. So immune complexes are a giveaway sign that there is a pathogen present in a place, and therefore the inflammatory response is initiated. So, where are the sentinel cells then of the synovial joints? Well, of course, they are the type A synoviocytes. These are macrophages. So, one function of a macrophage is to phagocytose things. The other function is to stand on guard and look for pathogens. So, they have a sentinel role. So these are a sentinel cell. A sentinel cell is just a cell that you find all over the body in many different tissues, whose job is to look for any signs that there is a pathogen present, and if they see it, to set off the inflammatory response. So, immune complexes are going to form now in the synovial membrane and in the synovial fluid, and these are now going to activate the type A synoviocytes because they are a giveaway sign that there is a pathogen present. Of course, the type A synoviocytes have not considered the possibility that this immune complex is formed between an antibody and a self-protein, because that shouldn't happen, but it has. Okay, so they have receptors on their surface known as Fc receptors, which can bind to immune complexes, and when they do bind to an immune complex, will activate the sentinel cell to start releasing molecules which will cause the inflammatory response. So just drawing a little picture here. Here is our type A synoviocyte. Here's its nucleus, and now on its surface it has an Fc receptor here. So this is the Fc receptor, and now what's going to happen is the immune complex is going to bind to that. So let me zoom in and I'll draw the immune complex in detail here. So here are the heavy chains of the antibody. Here are the light chains, and then one of these sites will have bound to some protein here. And we don't know what this protein is, but we think it is a self-protein. So this is a self-protein. Okay, right, so that's what's going to happen, and now, continuing the story on, the type A synoviocyte is now going to set off the alarm. It believes that it has apprehended something extremely dangerous, and it's going to set off the inflammatory response so that we can bring in troops to destroy this thing that is dangerous. And all the troops are in the bloodstream, and therefore we need to activate the endothelial cells to start the inflammatory response and bring the troops out from the bloodstream into the synovial joints. So they'll release loads of inflammatory mediators, loads of pro-inflammatory molecules. The two that you must absolutely know because they're so important are tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-1. They are the major alarm signals that a sentinel cell can release to trigger the inflammatory response. So TNF-alpha stands for tumor necrosis factor alpha. Okay, and interleukin-1 or IL-1 stands for interleukin-1. So writing out its full name here, interleukin-1. Okay, so these are absolutely crucial molecules to know about. They're both proteins and they are the major alarm signals to set off an inflammatory response. So these will now go from the intima to the subintima, so they'll go into the subintima here. They'll act on the endothelial cells of the arterioles, the capillaries, and the venules, and they will trigger the inflammatory response. So they act on the microvasculature blood vessels to trigger the inflammatory response. And just going over what inflammation involves, remember inflammation will involve vasodilatation of the arterioles. So the arterioles will vasodilate, they'll expand their diameter to allow more blood to flow through, and the purpose of that is so that we can recruit more troops from the bloodstream, because all the troops are coming from the bloodstream to fight this pathogen. If we've got more blood flow through this area, then the amount of troops that we could recruit is increased. So as part of the inflammatory response, you'll get vasodilatation of the arterioles. So vasodilation or vasodilatation, whichever you prefer, of the arterioles. Then in the capillaries and the post-capillary venules, you'll get endothelial cell contraction and leukocyte recruitment, which we've discussed previously when we were going over the calcification process. But I'll just jot them down here. So you'll get endothelial cell contraction, and we know exactly what that will produce. It will produce an inflammatory exudate, which brings in all sorts of proteins that are present in the blood to fight the pathogen. That's also going to produce swelling because you're bringing in all this fluid. And you also get leukocyte recruitment. So white blood cells are going to be brought in from the bloodstream to fight the pathogen as well. So leukocyte recruitment will occur, and this will produce more swelling as well. Okay, so these things are going to produce swelling. Okay, so overall what has happened here is you've got an inflammatory response in the synovial joints, and therefore you're going to get swelling of the swelling of the synovial joints, and this is called arthritis, which just means inflammation of the joints. So this is one of the key things that happens in acute rheumatic fever. So 80% of people get some involvement of the synovial joints, which will involve arthritis. And of course, this will cause pain in the joints, which is called arthralgia. And just to go over a little bit about why you'll get pain in the joints, it's because you also, along with interleukin-1 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, will be releasing loads of other inflammatory mediators of inflammation. And one crucial one to know the name of is prostaglandin E2, PGE2. So this is prostaglandin E2. And this will be released by the sentinel cells when they want to trigger off the red alert signal, the alarm signal, and it will affect the nerve cells in the synovial subintima and will trigger pain. So it will affect pain cells in the synovial subintima, and I realise this has got a little bit messy, but never mind. So it will affect these pain neurons here. So I told you that there were nerve cells with their endings in the synovial subintima. Prostaglandin E2 can affect the ones that mediate pain, so it will activate them to fire action potentials, and that will give you the sensation of pain. The other thing that will happen is that when you get inflammation in many places in the body, what happens is, or in any place at all in the body in fact, when you get inflammation full stop somewhere in the body, that site of inflammation secretes another very important mediator called interleukin-6, IL-6. And interleukin-6 goes in the blood and it goes to the brain and it activates an increase in body temperature. So I'll just draw this. It goes up to the brain and it causes body temperature to go up. So body temperature is going to go up. And this, of course, is called a fever. And the reason this is done is to try and make the temperature of the body less easy for the pathogen, whatever it is, to actually live in. So you try to change body temperature to make it hotter so that the environment is more hostile for the pathogen, in the hope that the pathogen will no longer actually be able to live in the body if it's at this higher temperature. So remember, when you've got inflammation, it's usually, or indeed it's meant to be, because you're attacking a pathogen. So that's the basis of why you get a fever. It's to try and make the environment more hostile for the pathogen to actually be able to live in. And interleukin-6 is one of the key mediators that goes up to the brain and tells the brain to raise core body temperature, because core body temperature is under the control of an ancient portion of the brain known as the hypothalamus. So it specifically goes up to the hypothalamus and triggers this to change its control of body temperature so that body temperature is brought up. So this is why you get a fever. So now we have completely justified why acute rheumatic fever is called rheumatic fever, because it principally involves the joints. The joints are the major place that's involved, and it will also cause a fever. Now, I'm aware that this video has gone on now for an hour and 10 minutes, so I'm going to call a break here. In the next video, we'll finish our discussion of acute rheumatic fever. We will see how the skin can also be involved, rarely. The brain can also be involved, specifically the corpus striatum, and this can cause a rather terrifying neurological condition called Sydenham's chorea. And then we'll go on to how it can affect the heart and therefore lead to the chronic complication of rheumatic heart disease.